1970s, prisons were a place for the really bad criminals, those who were extremely violent or who were deemed incorrigible. Since the 1970s, however, our prison population has skyrocketed. Even nonviolent offenders and first-time offenders are finding their way behind bars. As a result, we now have the highest incarceration rate in the world. How and why did our prison system get this big, and what are the consequences for our society? I'll answer some of these questions in this lecture today. Between 1975 and 2002, the U.S. prison population went from just under 205,000 to over 2 million. That's an increase of nearly 900%. In 2005, nearly 7 million individuals in the United States were in prison, in jail, or under correctional supervision. And the incarceration rate today is 5 times what it was between 1925 and 1970. Federal and state spending on prisons has risen in step with this increasing prison population. It went from $4 billion in 1982 to over $35 billion in 2005. The fact remains that even in the current recession and budget crisis, we see continued spending on federal and state prisons. Indeed, in over 5 states, state spending on prisons is higher than state spending on higher education. What's fueling the increase in the U.S. prison population? Well, it turns out that it has absolutely nothing to do with an increase in crime. The U.S. crime rate has gone up and down since 1970, despite a clear trend toward increased incarceration. What seems to be driving the expansion in the U.S. prison system is 1, changes in sentencing laws, and 2, increased incarceration of non-violent offenders. First, since the 1980s, states and federal governments have passed mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Basically, when certain crimes are committed, the judge has no leeway or wiggle room in terms of deciding a sentence. They must pass down a particular sentence for particular crimes. This, on the whole, has made prison sentences longer. Between 1980 and 1996, for example, the average time spent in state prisons for murder increased from 5 years, this would be the average, to 10 years. 3 strike laws have also led to longer sentences for second and third time offenders. The second thing fueling the expansion of the U.S. prison system is that since the 1980s, we've chosen to incarcerate a larger number of non-violent offenders. As a result, by 2003, 48% of state inmates were in prison for non-violent offenses. Routine drug offenders account for a large proportion of these non-violent offenders. One of the more disturbing things that we're seeing as a result of these changes is an increase in the number of prisoners who are serving life sentences. As the New York Times article reports, 10% of individuals in U.S. prisons are there serving a life sentence. That's more than at any time in history. Because parole boards are less likely to grant parole today than they were 30 years ago, many of these lifers will remain in prison until their death. In fact, 6 states don't even allow for the possibility of parole for prisoners serving life sentences. Now, not all of these prisoners are serving a life sentence for violent crimes. In states like California, individuals can be put away for life due to repeat offenses, even in the case of non-violent offenses like theft or drug possession. Whether the prisoner is locked up for life due to a violent or non-violent offense, a sentence of life without parole suggests almost a complete abandonment of the rehabilitation model. Prisoners are no longer seen as individuals who can return to society, but as bad seeds that need to be isolated from society for the rest of their natural life. This increase in the number of prisoners who are serving life sentences has put a particular strain on prison budgets because prisoners who are older have more health needs, and prisoners who have more health needs are more expensive to incarcerate. More than 20% of the U.S. prison population is over the age of 50, and it costs roughly $100,000 a year per prisoner over the age of 50 just to keep them behind bars. The increase in life sentences doesn't just apply to adult offenders, but juvenile offenders as well. This week you watched a Frontline special called When Kids Get Life, and the episode focuses on the thousands of U.S. prisoners who were sentenced to life without parole when they were juveniles. The first part of this special discusses the 1992 case in Colorado in which a 15-year-old boy by the name of Jacob Ind shot and killed his mother and stepfather. Jacob Ind had been emotionally, physically, and sexually abused by his stepfather, but the jury found him guilty for first-degree murder. When the judge had to hand down his sentence, she essentially said, this is a really sad case. I really wish I could give him a lighter sentence or punishment, but my hands are tied due to the mandatory sentencing laws. And as a result, he was sentenced to life without parole. Now, the Frontline special explained that Colorado actually was a state that was internationally renowned for its special and careful treatment of juvenile defenders. But in the early 1990s, a spree of violence, much of it committed by young gang members, led to public fear and anxiety. A special session of the legislature, the state legislature, was called to tackle the issue of youth violence. And politicians at the time, who were eager to gain political points by appearing to be tough on crime, decided that if a juvenile committed an adult crime, that they could be treated as an adult in the Colorado State Court. Thus, children, no matter what their age, no matter what the circumstances were that led to their crime, could be put in prison for the rest of their natural life without parole. So much of the U.S. prison system defies basic logic. For example, you take nonviolent offenders and lock them up with incredibly violent criminals. Then you release those nonviolent offenders back into society with no financial support, no job training, no educational assistance, and no social services. Now, a reasonable person might argue that this only pushes people back into crime. Now, we also lock up young people in numbers that we've never seen in U.S. or world history. Increasingly, we're more likely to offer a poor teenager funding as a prisoner than we are to offer them funding as a college student. A reasonable person might argue that this does nothing to further the productive development of youth in our society. Finally, we devote enormous sums of money to building and staffing prisons when we have no evidence that it has any effect on crime. If crime rates are down, we say we need more prisons because prisons are working. If crime rates are up, we say we need more prisons because we need to get tough on crime. In no other area is the logic so flimsy. And yet in no other area are the stakes this high. Thank you.